All right, so for our 10-day lesson, we are focusing on the big idea of the changes in American life through social change. So we're focused mostly on the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement, along with general changes in life after post-World War II. So our first 2 days are focused on post-war economics, so how economics shaped American life, and then technology and how that came to change as technological innovations occurred. And then we jump into day 3, where we start this introduction to social change in post-war America and how these two things work together in order to encourage change. So on day 3, we're setting that scene to allow students to understand how there is change. So we're talking about how groups form and what events during World War II and immediately after lead to the civil rights movement. So then for day 4, 5, 6, and 7, we are talking about the civil rights movement. And day 8, we're talking about the women's liberation movement. And day 9, outcomes. And then in 10, we're bringing that all together for students to analyze how those changes actually affected American life.
So what specifically will students need to know to fully understand the big ideas of our 10-day unit? Students will need to fully understand the political and social climate of the Jim Crow era, as well as the civil rights era and the post-World War II era. Students will need to understand the struggle that certain minority groups and women had to endure to get equal rights and strive for equality, which is something that they're still striving for till today. Students will also need to understand why minority groups coalesced in this atmosphere to protest for equal rights, as well as women during this era. We want our students to have a broad understanding of the cause and effect relationship of different civil rights movements and how they affected each other and affected the United States for change.
Exactly. So we do predict some misunderstandings for students, especially studying this topic. So our big misconception that we're trying to stop before it occurs is that the 1965 Civil Rights Act made everything perfect in the United States. We don't want students coming away thinking that everything in our country, racially and with gender, are equal. So something that we're doing to combat that is actually having a speaker who has a firsthand account in Jim Crow and is obviously still alive today, so he can attest to the fact that things are not perfect in our country still. So that occurs on day 5?
Day 4, I believe.
Day 4. Okay, yeah, so we're having our guest speaker here, and our students really get the chance to interact with that guest speaker and ask them questions afterwards. So that can really affect how our summative assessment reflects those ideas. Another misconception that we're trying to prevent is that only leaders, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, have the propensity to cause change. We really want students to understand that everyday citizens are also able to have to cause change and to affect how things are in our country. So I think that really comes across in day 9, or day 10, I'm sorry, with the graphic novel that they're creating. The students get the chance to answer that big question that we want to know: is everything okay? What outcomes did they have? Did the civil rights movement have? Was it really as effective as people portray it? And then another misconception that we want to nip in the bud is that people often forget about the women's liberation movement that kind of goes along with the civil rights movement. So that's what day number 8 is really focusing on, is now. Where is it? So we want to answer the big questions: what were women fighting for? And then also in day number 9, we are bringing those things together. So what was women's role in the civil rights movement as well? We also have differentiation that can assist us. So Cody came up with some ideas here about providing annotated versions for those students that may need that with difficulty reading or that are English language learners. So that's a big thing that we want to include, is annotated readings, and also a lot of discussion. Discussion won't only help those that are challenging to read or write, but it will also help the whole class understand and share their opinion, which scaffolds to the day 10 summative assessment.
So the skills and knowledge that we want our students to come away with as a result of this unit, we want them to understand the civil rights movement, the atmosphere it happened under, what changes were they looking for? Did they actually affect these changes? Is equally or separate and equal actually a correct cause when uh, it, so we want students to understand that while the groups did fight for civil rights, it's something that they're still fighting for today. We haven't met racial equality or maybe gender equality yet, and that's something that we're still focusing on. And we want students to understand, although these were something, the rights that were protested for, it's something that isn't fully done yet. And the civil rights era of 1965 just didn't make everything perfect. So that's what the skills and the knowledge that we want our students to realize.
Absolutely. So the next thing we need to talk about is how we will scaffold knowledge and skill development to promote higher order thinking. So I kind of talked about that when we were talking about the misunderstandings and the things that we could do to prevent those misunderstandings from becoming something that our students truly believe. So we scaffolded with basic understandings of post-war life first. So that's when our day 2, day 3, and day 1 come in. We want students to really understand what it was like for the majority of people living after World War II. And then we go in to more concrete civil rights and women's liberation knowledge. So coming in down to day 4 is when they're starting to get the causes of the civil rights movement, learning those very fact-based things. So we started very general, moved to more specific. And then when we get down to day 9 and day 10, we are really encouraging students to become critical about that knowledge that we've given them and understanding the outcomes of that. So day 9 is focused really on the outcomes of these movements and allowing students to judge those things for themselves. So if you look at the second big question here, it says, how did these changes affect life for the average person? So that's when the students are becoming more critical of these movements and starting to think about their effectiveness. And then in day 10, the real big question that we're trying to get them to think, and as we can see with that formative assessment, is that we really want to know what were these movements able to achieve and what did they miss the mark on? And then we want to know how this social change shaped a new American way of life. I really challenge the students to ask themselves, did it actually create a new way of life or did it not? And then answer why. So that's when that formative assessment comes into play when they're doing a graphic novel. And I think the really cool thing is that the graphic novel works really well moving into the summative assessment. So in this graphic novel, they're asked that question, did American way of life change or not? And then give some justification with some historical evidence. And then in day 10 with their summative assessment, they're answering that question, but with more detail and with more evidence to justify their argument.
Yeah, as for assessments, we had a wide variety of assessments through exit slips with us, with an authentic guest speaker about the civil rights movement in the Jim Crow era. We also had a group project where we mapped civil rights movements and timeline where they mapped them chronologically in order, and this was being done on Google Earth. We use these assessments because we are trying to gauge our students' knowledge of civil rights, as well as giving them more depth of knowledge in the civil rights movement era, as well as how the social change happens through cause and effect. We have our students reflect a few times on how different today's civil rights atmosphere is towards the civil rights era and the Jim Crow era. And this is what our assessments are about. We want our students to have a better understanding of why and how the civil rights movement happened and how it affects our lives to this day.
Yeah, and so some of my assessments were very similar. It's all about that change. So my very first assessment was actually different because they got to take on a mini research project in which they're looking up technological innovations. And then we also have them doing a Venn diagram about some of these prominent civil rights leaders. So yeah, even though we know that everyday citizens can have a huge impact on civil rights, we also want to shine a light on these leaders that mean a lot and that are still very representative to people that still fight for civil rights today. And then, as Zach said, we have a lot of exit slips that are a real cause for reflection, which I think is really important because we're asking students to come up with a very strong opinion in our summative assessment, and it requires these reflections for them to be able to come to that conclusion. And like I said earlier, this formative assessment with the graphic novel scene really helps them perform this summative assessment because it's taking something much shorter and without a lot of detail, and then creating this analysis piece in which they have to really come to a very firm conclusion given all of the reflection and knowledge that they've got over that 10-day lesson. So I think we'd be really excited to show this with a future class. I think it would end up being a really good lesson plan.
I think it was a good lesson plan.
Awesome. All right.